Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting. I am Councilmember Hunt, and I am joined tonight with Council President Walsh and Councilmember Hall, and tonight is July 9th, 2024. There will be multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There will be a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, and there will be opportunities to make comments after the presentations on tonight's topics as well. And we will start with a general public comment opportunity. Members of the public may address council at this time in person or virtually. Those who are signed up in advance to make comments will be called on first. If you are joining us virtually and would like to make comments, please raise your virtual hand. And if you are on the phone, press *3. And if you've joined by computer or smartphone, please look for the hand icon, and this varies by device. If you're in the room and did not sign up, we will also call on you. So I will take a minute to find out if we have speakers for general public comments, and then I have some additional guidelines.
Chair Hunt, no one signed up prior to the meeting to speak.
All right, and we do have several members of the audience. Are there any members of the audience that would like to speak at the general public comment opportunity? Okay. All right. Then we will have more opportunities later on. And also as a reminder, written comments can be submitted at any time to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. Oh, and there's nobody that's indicating a desire online as well? Just confirm. No. Okay. So we will go to our first item. The first item tonight is COM 0019, Lakeside Transfer of Development Rights, and this will be presented by Director Dhaliwal.
I'm sorry, Chair, could I ask you to approve the prior set of minutes before we go into
I'm sorry, yes. First, we have the minutes of the May 7th meeting, which are in our packet. Do we have any corrections or any edits to those? Okay, then if you approve of having those be approved, please say aye. Aye. All right. Those are approved. We will go on to agenda items, COM 0019, Lakeside Transfer of Development Rights.
Good evening, council members and members of the community. So for this first topic, let me just begin the presentation. So I want to first acknowledge we have Jeff Watling, our Parks Director, here as well. So we've tag teamed on this item because it's half community development and half parks. And also online, we have Kim Adams-Pratt from Madrona Law Group, if council has any questions related to this item for the legal team. So for the purpose of tonight's meeting on this agenda item is, go back, review the transfer of development rights for city-owned park properties to Lakeside. And this is to comply with the agreement that was signed in 2013. So the direction we're seeking from the council committee is if you recommend authorizing the deed restrictions, which is the conservation easement for Harvey Manning Park and also for Corra Park. And also, second direction is if the committee authorizes transfer certificate to transfer the development rights from Berntsen, Inge Johnson, Confluence Park, Corra, and Harvey Manning Park to Lakeside property to comply with the prior development agreement. Again, just a quick background on what is transfer of development rights. It's basically to allow increased development on one parcel, the receiving property, in this case the Lakeside property, while protecting another parcel, the sending site. And generally, the sending sites are constrained sites that have critical areas and such. They can be bought between public agencies, private entities, but majority of this transfer of development rights happens in the private market where a sending property owner sells it to a receiving property owner. These can be used to increase either impervious surface, height, floor area ratio, or density at the receiving site. City's municipal code has a map that has mapped the sending sites, which are green, and the receiving sites, which are red on this map. In 2013, the city entered into a development agreement with Lakeside Industries And in that is a section 7.1.3, which obligates the city to provide 100 units transferred to the Lakeside properties at a fixed rate of $15,000 for each equivalent residential unit. And that, in essence, is really 0.63 multifamily unit, one single-family unit, or 1,200 square feet of commercial space. So it can be, one or the other. But for one ERU, it's a fixed price. It can be adjusted based on construction cost index. So in 2022, the city was notified by Lakeside Industries of their intention to purchase these 100, and they're called the mitigated SEPA equivalent residential units. So a long way of saying that they would, pay the mitigation fee fund. And in your memo, we kind of broke down what the current mitigation fees are. Again, the breakdown, so the city's been trying to find 100 units for this transaction to be completed. We had about 82 previously certified units. And then this chart here kind of explains how many total are certified for each of the park and what this transfer will entail. So for Berntsen, it would be 22 TDR units. For Inge Johnson, 15, and Conference Park, 18, Corra, 15, and Bergsma, Harvey Manning Park, a total of 30. So we can come up with a total of 100 transfer of development rights. Again, administration's recommendation is authorize the conservation easements for Bergsma and Corra properties. Those are the new documents that are part of your packet. We also recommend authorizing the transfer of development rights from all 5 parks in that table, the numbers that are just shared, to Lakeside properties. In terms of timing and next step, so we're here today at Planning, Development, and Environment Committee. Based on the committee's direction, we will schedule this item for City Council decision in July, August, after all the pending documents are completed. And after City Council action, if it is approved, then these transfer of development right certificates will be executed. The easements and transfer certificates will be recorded, and then transfer of funds will follow the council action. Just to circle back, the direction we're asking, authorizing of the 2 deed restrictions or conservation easements, and then also recommending, asking committee's recommendation on transferring the development rights from all 5 parks. With that, I conclude my presentation, but we're happy to answer any questions, the whole team.
Council President Walsh.
Thank you. I'm wondering, when I think of a transfer of development rights situation, I tend to think of a completely pristine, natural environment that we are buying to protect and then transferring the development rights. In this case, several of these are actively used parks and things like that. Is there a way we should be thinking about that? Is it normal and typical to use an already, I wouldn't say developed, but at least in use park to do a transfer of development rights?
Sure. By authorizing transfer of development rights, you're binding any future councils to be able to sell that property for development. So those transfer rights are taken away from that particular property if this transfer occurs. In terms of comparison between a developed park versus an open space, more naturalistic critical areas piece, you still have to determine the certification of how many units can be transferred. It still needs to be established, and that's based on the zoning and how much of it is developable land. There's a whole exercise that establishes how many units can actually be transferred. But all of these sites are on the city's sending site map. I think there may be some additional clarification from Kim on this question.
I would only add that the the TDR program that was adopted by council in 2023 kind of updated things. And one of the specific intents was to add park space. So I think you added in a different dimension in addition to open space of park space. So this can't, this could not be developed for anything else other than the park space and more traditional open space.
Thank you, Kim. Would you mind also introducing yourself and your role for the record and for the public?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm Kim Adams Pratt. I am one of the attorneys at Madrono Law Group that represents the city of Issaquah.
Great. Thank you so much. Additional questions? Okay, I have a few if you want to. Okay. So my first question is, in the memo, there is a snippet of this agreement from 2013, and it's not clear to me from that snippet, is this 100 TDRs the extent of the agreement compliance, or is this the first step towards compliance?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of provisions in the development agreement. The
Okay.
city's obligation to provide is 100 transfer of development rights. It also has provisions where in the private market, Lakeside could go and seek 400 additional transfer of development rights to raise the total number of development, ERUs that can be built on that property to about 1,200 units total. So if tomorrow they want to develop, they can do 700. From 700 to 800, this transaction will get them 800 units. But they can increase that to 1,200 by getting some additional transfer of development rights from the private market.
Okay, thank you. So this does then conclude the city's responsibility,
Obligation for
city's
the
obligation.
TDRs.
Yes. Okay. Okay. And if we are in the way I read this snippet from the agreement, they decide when they want to do this. So we have to, our parameter space for what we can decide is we have to figure out which 100 units, but the 100 units that's set, and the timing is also set because it's up to the property administrator. That's all correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay. Did the city, in considering, you have several options here of different parks, including the Bergsma property, were there other things that were considered that are also sending sites that did not make it onto this list?
I would defer to Jeff. My understanding is we had a hard time getting this 100, but
Yeah.
what were the other parks?
Yeah.
Thanks, Minnie. Good question. Jeff Watling, Parks and Community Services Director. As we worked with planning, as they notified of Lakeside's interest in pursuing this, we started with those sending sites and also started with the units that were already identified. So I guess to answer your question, it became pretty evident that these 5 sites, these 5 locations, the 3 that already had existing TDRs ready and in place made sense with the recent purchase of Harvey Manning Park expansion, the Bergsma property, knowing that was a sending site previously identified before we bought it. But now that we owned it fee simple and with deed, it made sense for that property to be a candidate to consider.
Okay. Thank you. So just so I understand, though, there's 33 units right now from Bergsma. Is that the extent of the TD? Does that cover all of Bergsma? Or, okay.
That's my understanding, yes. Minnie can probably answer that.
Okay.
They did the calculation for the TDR numbers.
That is correct. That is our calculation.
Okay, so is this all of these properties and it worked out to be 100?
Well, we're not selling all of them. So
Okay.
if you look in the one column, there's like 2 remaining for each park.
Oh, I see.
Or
Okay.
2 or 3 remaining for each park.
Okay. Yes, I see that now. So, all right. Then there's, this leads into my next question, which is, it says that TDR is, oh, no, it doesn't. So does this restrict more on some parts of some properties than others? And what does that do for, planning, for the uses of the parks? How does that influence what we can and can't do on almost all of these properties, but not quite all of these properties? Like not quite all of each one.
Yeah, I'll take a good effort at that, and Kim can certainly help as well. Really appreciate Kim Adams-Pratt. Again, Robin Spear and Kim are the ones that drafted the conservation easement that's proposed before you. I guess to start with answering that, I would note that all of these are currently owned by the city of Issaquah. And in that acquisition, many of these were used with grant funds. Those grant funds have grant covenants, deed covenants already put onto these properties. And so the conservation easements that are before you are not meant to take the place of or supersede. In many places, they're just complementing the restrictions that are already on that site. What we tried to do in drafting that conservation easement is look ahead. You may notice as you read the Bergsma property, that has some different language in it because that is really intended as open space and conservation of forested hillside. Its mix of conservation and recreational uses are going to be very different. Bergsma is really going to be identified recreationally as trails, but mostly habitat conservation is a high priority, whereas the Corra conservation easement, knowing that will and is intended to be a future neighborhood park that connects to our other downtown parks, wanted to recognize ability for that future planning, community outreach, community engagement to identify what's possible and potential there. So these easements made every effort to protect the sites in perpetuity as parks, but also give that ability and understanding that there will be some degree of investment, both conservation-related investment, but also some recreational investment on those sites.
I would add that on each of these conservation easements, there's a map attached. So say for the Bergsma property in your packet, it's on page 25. And that outlines for you, there's a note, it says limits of protected property. And in both of these cases, the conservation easement covers the entirety of the city-owned property. So the city could have kept some of the property out and not covered it with the conservation protection easement, but the decision was to not do that. And so for both Bergsma and Corra, the easement covers the entire property. So everywhere on the property is protected exactly the same under the easement.
Okay, thank you. That also helps. So for the property, the Eck House property, which is in the Confluence Park set of TDRs, because we've talked about how to make sure that we make that a space that is used, provides public benefit, and that will require some work. Does this impact those plans at all?
This would not impact future restoration and sort of redevelopment, historically landmarking the Eck House and having it available for public use.
Okay, and then my last question, which you already pretty much answered, but just to confirm, so this TDR process isn't expected to impact any of the conservation efforts or easements or other plans for Bergsma in terms of making sure that it remains public open space and in fact maybe reinforces it based on that we're binding future councils, as you mentioned earlier.
That would be our hope. This complements the protections that are already on that site and just let me remind you, King County Conservation Futures money that was provided to us in that acquisition, the RCO, the state urban wildlife habitat funding that we received for the acquisition of that site, that also has covenants. You remember the carbon credit program that we implemented on Bergsma, that also has some protections. So this is not meant to supersede or take the place of, it's really meant to complement those protections that are already on that really important parcel.
Okay, thank you. Last question, which I think is maybe Director Dhaliwal. This is an agreement from 2013. This TDR for the cities covers the city's portion of this agreement. Are there other agreements out there where we also are expecting to need to find or need to have sending sites for TDRs in other development agreements that you're aware of?
That I'm not aware of, but I do know, there was, not the city's obligation. I think there are maybe terms in other development agreements that I
Sure,
can think of,
yeah.
like Rowley Properties. Actually, there was one unit that was transferred from one place to the other or something like that. But that can happen outside of the city's obligation. I'm not aware of, I haven't, done- not that I know of.
Okay, well, when this comes back to council, I think that would be a
We can
good
look into
context
that
piece,
further. Absolutely.
just to confirm that. Okay, those were my questions. Councilmember Hall, do you have addition? Yes.
Yeah,
Councilmember Hall.
sure. Yeah, I think just a couple. So even with, seems like quite a bit of an assurances that the conservation easement is there to help protect the intended use of that as open space and recreation. It's still not quite clear to me reading the conservation easement for the Bergsma property, the intent to which, what kinds of improvements can be constructed on the site. So I'm wondering if we can kind of walk through that part of the easement together.
Sure, I will. Oh, go ahead, Kim.
No, go ahead, Jeff. I was just going to say it's really in section 4 of the agreement.
Yeah, that's where I was gonna add. If you read the easement, going to section 4, it really expresses what is allowed. So you'll see things like, recreation related to trail use, speaks to our commitments to addressing the already existing covenants and putting together maintenance practices as well as any proposed improvements that do not impact. And in fact, in both conservation easements, I would point out, you'll see the term conservation and recreation values. And that is defined at the beginning of the conservation easement, really that is the intent of this protection, to not do anything, not propose, even as we build trails or build what is proposed, it is not meant to take away from the conservation and recreational value. It's meant to improve it and build upon it. So section 4 kind of speaks to what can be done. Section 5 then goes into what is not allowed. And you'll see a number of things that are not allowed. I would point out, just because it has come up in public comment, cell towers are listed there as not something that is allowed. Because again, that would detract from the conservation and recreational value on this site. So think of section 4 as our sort of management boundaries and what we're going to try and do, and section 5 is those things that we want to limit and or not allow on the site.
Okay,
So that's where you'll see section 4 is a little bit different, spells out a different set of recreational opportunities and, quite frankly, conservation commitments on Bergsma than Corra. They were really, I think, again, well written by Kim and by Robin to be site specific and future specific in terms of what those sites may become.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it was a little unclear to me exactly what kinds of utilities would be prohibited versus allowed. So I'm seeing that now.
Another thing I would note, not only in terms of utilities in this conservation easement, but again, remember there's 3 other deeds and covenants on that site.
Yeah.
So any proposed utility would also have to abide within the covenants and restrictions of those 3 other sites. This doesn't take the place of those requirements as well. So
No, good reminder.
when it comes to do trail development or anything on the Bergsma site, we're going to have to be really intentional and make sure we're abiding by all 4 of these restrictions and covenants.
Thank you. And then Director Dollywall, you had also said that on none of these, in none of these areas are we selling all of the TDR units that are available. And I'm just wondering why that is, if there was a particular rationale that went into keeping a couple for a particular site.
Jeff can probably explain the rationale from a park planning perspective?
Yeah, I'll do my best to explain, and Kim, please jump in as well. So just more future thinking, not knowing what might be on the horizon, not knowing, again, knowing the protection of these as park properties in perpetuity. If there was a time, sometime in the future, where codes changed or rules changed, and there was a perception that every development right was stripped from this park property, therefore not allowing any type of park development to happen. This is, I guess, department director's recommendation to suggest maybe we keep a couple on there, just in case.
And I would say a little bit simpler. We were only obligated to find 100 for Lakeside. And that meant that there were several left over in the parks. And so we're only selling them 100. That's just how the math worked out.
Thanks, Kim. That's much simpler.
No, thank you. I mean, both of those are helpful for my understanding, because I guess with your answer about Bergsma and all the different things that are impacting that property, I was thinking it might make sense to sell all of the ones from the other sites before touching any of the TDRs at Bergsma, because it's so complicated. But maybe that's not the right rationale in terms of what you were saying, kind of future-proofing, being prepared for parks planning.
Yeah, Kim, I'm going to let you speak to this, because I think you do a good job of addressing sort of what the conservation easement allows us to do, park development.
Yeah, we weren't able to keep out any one of these properties by selling all the units. You know, on them, we needed to include all of them. So, but we held a few back from several. But for park development, we don't need ERUs. That's for that's for residential use, commercial use. And so while we're being very conservative and holding a few back and not selling them, they aren't needed for, say, installing a field or a trail or a kiosk, anything like that. We don't need ERUs to do that.
Thank you. My last question then is, I guess, most of the times when items come before committee or council, there are options and different levers if committee or council wants to change things. Those don't really exist in this kind of situation, right? It was a struggle to come up with the 100 TDRs in the first place, and we have to comply with the terms of the DA. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the city's under a contract to provide 100 units. The options for council are, if you don't like the mix of what is proposed, you could change that mix. You could tell us to go look for some other property, So, but it is a legal contract between the city and Lakeside.
And is there a time, that just made me think of another one. Is there a time from which Lakeside approached the city and said, we'd like to purchase these 100 units as per our contract in 2022, that we have to have gone through a process with them, or is it kind of open?
I don't think there's a firm timeline, but we do want to honor, their timeline of when they want to do the development. And
Okay, thank you. Are there other large open spaces like in the city that are owned by the city that could be an option for selling TDRs? Or I know you said it was hard to find these, but
yeah, they have to
gonna
be on the
circle
map,
back.
the sending sites. They have to be designated on the map for the city to transfer them. Is there any other large sites?
Hi again. Yeah, step one would be needing to bring legislation before you to put that property on as a sending site.
okay.
So that hasn't been done yet. We do have some recent acquisitions, the Squawk Mountain Estates property. We did look at that with the planning team. That would yield a pretty small number of units, but again, would require a first step of amending Title 18 to get that site onto the map before sending sites from it or sending TDRs from it.
Okay, thank you. I think that's our questions for now. We can ask questions after if we have public comment. So with that, we will go now to public comment on this item. Are there any members of the public that would like to speak on this item? Okay. I have some additional comments to read. I did not read them at the beginning because we didn't have any public comment. So public comments are an important part of the public process. We take them very seriously and factor them into the decisions we make. During audience comments, members of the public are invited to address all of us regarding the matters that are directly related to city programs, projects, services, or events, except public hearing items, quasi-judicial items, or campaign-related matters. And when recognized, please unmute the microphone. So for the podium, there's a little button that you will press. Please state your name, address, and relationship to the city, and please speak clearly and pause frequently. If you are attending virtually and do not respond, or if your connection is lost, the meeting will need to proceed, and you can write written comments to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. And then personal attacks, obscene language, or derogatory remarks and disruptive behaviors such as shouting, booing, clapping, and stomping feet will not be permitted. If the speaker is out of order, the presiding officer will direct the speaker to return to his or her seat, or for virtual attendees may direct the staff to mute the microphone. There's some additional comments in our packet. Are there any members of the public on the on our virtual call as well that would like to speak? Just so I know.
Chair Hunt, I see 2 hands raised to speak to this topic among our virtual attendees.
Okay. Well, then we will first go with the commenter in the room, and then we will go to the virtual commenter.
Great. Good evening, council members. My name is Kim Lee. I'm an Issaquah resident and president of Roadstone, which is the real estate development arm of Lakeside Industries. I'd like to start by thanking Minnie and Jeff and Kim and your staff for all the hard work that went into this transfer of development rights package that we're talking about tonight. And I'd like to thank each of you for your consideration of what we think is a really wonderful opportunity for the city and its future growth. Not only do these conservation easements before you tonight and their transfer of TDRs satisfy a contract provision between the city and Lakeside under the development agreement, but they preserve these parks for the benefit of the community in perpetuity, meaning forever. And we believe that's a win-win for all involved, especially the community. On the topic of TDRs, Minnie mentioned that the development agreement between the city and Lakeside requires that Lakeside obtain an additional 400 TDRs, which are not currently available in the city of Issaquah at that scale. So therefore, we will need to acquire those TDRs through another mechanism. And Minnie mentioned one option being through the private market. Another option is by way of a renewed interlocal agreement with King County. We believe that by entering into a new interlocal agreement, that would be an amazing tool that would benefit the city. So by entering into this agreement with the county, it would allow the city to reap the benefits of the Landscape Conservation Local Infrastructure Program. It's a long LCLIP that you might be more familiar with. In the 2023-24 biannual budget, the city approved funds for a TDR and LCLIP feasibility study to explore the city's benefit of such a program. In a nutshell, LCLIP not only supports regional conservation goals of preserving agricultural and forest lands, but would provide potentially millions of dollars of additional tax revenue to the city of Issaquah for infrastructure, which is very broadly defined by the state to include roads, utilities, parks, additional parks, and now that definition has been expanded to include affordable housing. The LCLIP program is an amazing opportunity for the city because it would obtain up to 75% of King County's share of the increased property taxes generated over many years. Issaquah is the only city in the region where there is a buyer of TDRs at the scale that we're talking about, which would significantly increase tax revenues for the city's infrastructure needs. The prior interlocal agreement between the city and King County expired in 2015, but you have the opportunity to prioritize and realize this opportunity to preserve lands while bringing significant revenue to the city. Switching gears, I'd also like to express my support for the housing analysis, which is a later item on the agenda tonight. But I'm going to use my time wisely here. My hope is that you would consider an MFTE program for the entire city rather than limiting the scope to Central Issaquah. We understand that the future development of Central Issaquah is a priority to the city, but there's a significant amount of development planned in the Highlands and elsewhere, including our project, that should be included in that analysis. We all know that we need more affordable and middle housing in our community, and MFTE is a very effective way to fill that need. In fact, we at Roadstone would welcome the opportunity to participate in an MFTE program to increase the amount of affordable housing in our community. As I've mentioned before, I would love the opportunity to meet with you and discuss TDRs, MFTE, and our future plans for the Lakeside development that was envisioned by us in the city over 10 years ago. Also, King County and Forterra have also expressed strong interest in discussing these topics with council members and with staff as well. I'm looking forward to the continued discussions and seeing the city make progress towards these goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. City Clerk, there are members of the public online that would like to speak on this topic.
Yes, Chair Hunt.
All right, if we can have the first of those members of the public.
Nancy, I am making you a panelist. You should should now have the ability to unmute your microphone and turn on your camera. Please state your full name for the record. Nancy, can you hear us?
Hi, this is Nancy Davidson. I'm a resident in Old Town at 405 Southeast Bush Street, and I wanted to speak to this subject. One of the things that I really think is important as we're looking at it, I totally support the transfer of development rights. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great way to utilize the available property in the city. However, I am concerned about the conservation easements as they're currently written, particularly on the Bergsma and the Corra properties. And the reason I'm really concerned is when the staff person, I don't remember it was Jeff or Minnie that stated they're not knowing what was on the horizon. And that's the concern I see when I read these easements, is that there's some flexibility in here to allow some options that could affect the city in the intent. While we were not given the full Bergsma underlying documents, the other ones that came through with the county, I'm concerned that there might be things in the future that would impact this. And given the amount of time the council and the city and many of its committees took looking at Title 18 and the land use codes, trying to protect the environmental areas of the city, I urge the council to look carefully at how much flexibility they want to provide in these easements for what might be coming down on the horizon. I don't think that these easements specifically identify that the intent of them is to follow all of the permitting requirements of the city. For example, all the Title 18 requirements. One of them includes the ability to provide stormwater in it and restrooms. Well, I agree that's part of a park, but that's something, council, I would urge you to consider if that's what you want in these areas. At some point, we know that PSC and other utilities are going to be looking for locations to put facilities as they try and meet the expanding growth of this community and other areas. And so whatever flexibility or things that are coming down on the horizon, this council has the opportunity through these easements to identify how you want to protect these lands. And I'm not sure the documents that you have in hand provide that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nancy. City Clerk, can we please go to the next speaker?
Yes. Susan Neville. Susan, I am making you a panelist. You should be able to unmute your mic and turn on your camera. Susan, can you hear us?
Oh, where? Unmute,
Yes, we
undo my
can,
mic.
we can hear you.
hear you.
Oh, hi, everybody. Let me, I wanted to see everybody because it's been quite some time. Due to health issues, I have not been able to attend at the way I wanted to, I'm Susan Neville. I'm a 26-year resident of Issaquah. I've spent numerous hours helping with giving my opinion on Title VIII changes and code changes from the person of a community background. And I have not been involved recently due to current health issues, but it doesn't mean that I don't love Issaquah and that it's still not the most important area that we've been given. And everything I've heard, like from Nancy just recently and from Connie Marsh, I'm in total agreement with regarding protecting this to the best of our abilities. We've been given a gift, and I know there's many ways to look at it, and taxpayer dollars coming and going. But the bottom line is taxpayer dollars did make this purchase possible. And that's the bottom line. So I appreciate everyone who is looking into this and putting their time into keeping this gift for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Are there any other members of the public online that would like to comment on this item?
Chair Hunt, I see no other virtual hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. Are there any members of the public in council chambers that would like to speak on this item? Okay, welcome, Connie.
Hi, my name's Connie Marsh, and I don't know how many years I've been looking at TDRs, so this was interesting. And the conservation easement language of the past and to now, I've read pretty much all of them, and they're hard to enforce, and then you have multiple layers of contradictory external requirements. And so every new person who reads these conservation easements is not going to know how it fits in with everything else. And so I've experienced that when our new parks director came in and things started happening around conservation easements. They were just lost. And so things have happened in parks that should not have happened under the conservation easements. So my first topic is a conservation easement should reflect all of the requirements so that they're in one document so that people can actually use them effectively. Because it's hard taking 4 layers, right? And then I read the city code, and it turns out that there is a section for parks and there's a section for preservation, and there are 2 different mechanisms for preserving. And so what they have done, which doesn't seem to be supported by code, is they have taken the more active park parts and the more conservation parts and mushed them all together. And that is one of the things that's creating this sort of odd protect, but somehow a gravel parking lot is going to be something that's both protective and helping the park. And I think that's really confusing because somebody is going to be having to judge, well, is this environmentally protective like we say, or do we really need to have a parking lot for people to be able to park and visit the park? And who is going to define that? Who's going to say, yes, it's okay? It's in the conservation easement that you can, but if it's going to impact the environment, can you really? So who's going to judge it? And then the stewardship plan. The stewardship plan is supposed to be a part of the conservation easement that effectively says how you are managing and maintaining your parks. And that stewardship plan is not in these conservation easements as it required by code, because we're expecting to keep these in good condition. This does not tell us how we're going to do that. And then in 5, you have several places that say, no, you cannot do a utility, but then it says, oh, unless it's allowed by the city, the state, or the feds. And then you go down to another section in 5, and it says the same thing. So how does that actually work out? We have that Tibbetts example of the cell tower, and it does say, it says above ground, so a cell tower might not be the greatest example, but it's the idea of it can't be anywhere else. City code says if it can't be anywhere else, then you could locate it in this area. So does that mean you can take down some trees, and then because you're replanting trees, because code says you can, it's okay to put this in Bergsma? And these are the types of conflicts in language that create problems, because who is the decision maker and who's going to say it's okay or not okay? And I would clear out those contradictory language pieces and just say you can't. And if you want a parks section where you want to be able to put a parking lot, say, okay, well, in this area, we're going to be able to do more. But for Corra property, most of Corra property is either floodplain or creek buffer. There's very little left out of that. And so then when they say, ooh, we can do stormwater, well, what exactly does that mean? Are you going to be able to like cut out most of Corra Park to reduce flooding? And so now you've actually reduced the amount of land in Corra Park, because this conservation easement says that you can use Corra Park to reduce flooding. Is that really what you want to say in your conservation easement? Is that what you want to do with Corra Park? So I would ship it back, and I would have a conversation about it at Park Board and Environmental Board, because these are 2 combined issues, and it has come straight to you without that public review. And so I would ship it back as a complex piece and try to get a better grasp of what we really want. Really? Huh. I'm assuming that was telling me to stop.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you all for those comments. Do we have additional questions, Council? Oh, I'm sorry. Dave, welcome.
It's on. David Kapler, 255 Southeast Andrews Street. I think this is a complicated issue, and it does, I think it needs some clarification, partly to facilitate in the future when somebody's trying to figure out what we might want to do on certain pieces of property. Just example, we would the bathroom, the whole bathroom thing is the county built their nice big Tree Ridge trailhead, but can only put it in an outhouse, right? Is my understanding. Even because they're in the county, they're not in the city, and they can't hook up to the sewer, even though there's a sewer line right there in the street. So, I mean, we've kept a few ERUs from Bergsma. Is that going to be how we can try and maybe get on city's property a bathroom? I don't know. These kinds of things, but it needs some clarification, I think. The suggestion of the Park Board, Environmental Board taking a look at this, I think, is well worth it. I think, yeah, that's, I guess, that. it's interesting, we're going back a long ways on this commitment that we've made. I think we're able to do a better job than we would have done maybe if we'd made all the original commitments. I have a lot of confidence in the city, the council, and staff. So let's work on it a little bit more, and we're going to get there and give us more of a feeling, a long-term feeling of what we're going to do, and long-term a little stronger long-term protection. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Are there any other members of the public, either in the room or online, that are indicating a desire to speak on this item? I'm not seeing anyone in the audience, and there are no additional members of the public online wishing to speak on this item, so thank you all again. Now we will go to any additional questions, or if not, we will go to comments. I did have one question. So there was some, in the comments, there was some discussion about how the different, conservation easement and the other code works together and who enforces and all of that. And so I wondered if you could speak to that. From your earlier comments, my understanding is that this is putting additional restrictions. It's the TDR, so it's reducing the uses on the property in terms of building, but it's not in conflict with the other items. But if there were something that had to be judged, who would judge that and how would it be enforced?
So if and when the city decides to do anything on these parcels, we are still an applicant, and we go to the regulatory agency, and there's a permitting process to do anything on that site. So anything in a conservation easement doesn't allow us to skip that process. Another commitment that we make, that you as council make, that the mayor makes, that we as staff make, is when it comes time to do anything on the Bergsma property, trail construction, there'll be public outreach, there'll be community outreach as to what that process will be. And so balancing this conservation easement with what might be done in the future on any of these properties doesn't take the place of that requirement that anything we propose needs to meet code, needs to address any impacts that it has and mitigate for any of those impacts. Does that help answer your question?
I think so. So I think then community planning and development would be the arbiter of if there was some ambiguity between what is allowed with the easement and what is allowed in code or something like that. It would come down to community planning and development to make that determination. Is that correct? Oh,
I would answer that both apply. So section 4.2 in the conservation easements, it is a statement that the applicable laws, so Title 18 that was brought up in an earlier context, always applies. So the conservation easement could never allow something to be done that Title 18 prohibits. And then in regard to utilities, those are in section 5.12, and any utility that's allowed has to serve the park amenity and comply with local laws. So it always has to be for the park amenity. There's that restriction.
okay. Thank you. Did you have additional?
No,
thoughts on
I was
this?
just going to say, because these are city-owned properties, in addition to the code and community planning and development's role, the funding from the council of what happens on these parks, the park board's review of what the vision for these parks is, all of that plays into what happens with these capital projects. Then, of course, the added layer of regulatory is, critical areas and other things that have come through the policy discussions, there are regulations that will ensure that those are complied with.
Okay, thank you. And one more question. So this is a 2013 agreement. It was brought to the city in 2022, was notified by Lakeside Industries. Is there a pressing urgency on making this decision that's before council, or is there a timeline restriction there?
You know, the funds should transfer by the end of the year if we are going to do this in this fashion, because the cost inflation index then is frozen from the time the request came in. But I'm
Okay,
sure
thank
the
you.
applicant has a timeline that they're trying to complete.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, thoughts, Councilmember Hall? Question?
Another question. I forgot to ask this earlier, but I had also noticed that I have a touch with the Parks Board or the Environmental Board, and I was wondering if there was kind of some intention behind that, or if you see that maybe there's potential value to go to those boards, and then also if we would have time to stick to the same timeline.
Certainly your call with time. I'll let Minnie answer some of this too, as the TDR program is really community planning and development. I guess as we've talked with Kim Adams-Pratt and others, understanding this is already a council-approved development agreement. So this is not staff isn't bringing forward a TDR wish. This is an obligation that we are legally required to do. And so it wasn't meant to bypass a board by any means. It was really meant to, this is an obligation that needs to be fulfilled.
And I think another concern is, what are we asking them? You know, we're basically saying, give us input on something that was decided 10 years ago. And so, I mean, that's a challenge. And, you know, we could spend multiple meetings explaining processes, understanding, but at the end of the day, we can say this was decided by the city council 10 years ago. There are multiple restrictions already placed on the property. And oh, by the way, anything that would have to be done has all of these things that have to be done. Comply with Title 18, go through public processes. So, you know, we always try to hesitate to take the time of our boards and commissions when at the end of the day, the answer is a decision was made 10 years ago.
Yes, thank you for that. I do think what was asked about in public comment seems to me was also specific to the content of the conservation easement language and making sure that that complied with best practices for conservation of these specific parks and things like that. So if we were to, I agree that if we were to send something for review by our volunteer boards, it should be a substantive discussion. It seems to me like that's a potential item that's not the TDR and not that these TDRs from these properties, but rather the content of the conservation easement. Is that fair to, would that be a substantive discussion, or is that also so limited that there wouldn't be much for
Well, I think it would take, we would need to walk through all existing easements that we have so that they'd have some context. Then we'd also have to walk through all of the existing covenants that have been placed on these properties either by their purchase or by money that we've used for those. All of which we can do. I think it's the concern of elapsed time. How many hours would we need to take with each of these groups to bring them up to speed so that they can then understand what you're asking them to weigh? And if that's something the council feels is valuable, you know, certainly we're prepared to do it. We get a lot of pushback from our boards and commissions about elapsed time of things that are asked. Again, this seems like something that would take us quite a bit of time to bring them to the level that they could have a discussion that was thoughtful. But if that's something the council would like to do, we can look at their agendas through the fall and make adjustments as needed.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have clarification on those. Do we have additional questions? Okay, and then if we can pull up the questions that you would like our feedback on from your slide deck, that could also help us make sure to answer those. Anyone like to kick us off here? All right, Council President Walsh.
been pretty quiet through questions because to me this seems like a pretty straightforward idea. I think the TDR portion is not in question. That is something that we as a community have supported, that we have a commitment to do according to our development agreement. So I don't think there's any questions there. I think the process that City Administrator Bobkowitz mentioned about having to bring the boards up to speed and we'd have to go through all of these documentation, I appreciate that. And to me, that's exactly what would have to happen if there was a proposed development or change on one of these sites after doing this approval. So I feel like the requirements of this deed restriction and conservation easement, in addition to all of the other requirements from the grant funding and things like that, do protect these properties from development. And I feel pretty good about that going forward. So.
Okay. So I sort of similarly, big picture, we have our hands bound by the council from 2013, and we are binding, we're passing along that binding to future councils, but we also are under contract by the council decision from 2013. So I do think we have to honor that. I don't see, as has been explained by staff, we don't have a lot of existing options for these TDRs, and these ones do seem like reducing the amount of development rights on these complies with my understanding of the community's vision for these properties, these parks and parcels where we want to maintain public benefit in terms of potentially recreational park type activities, but not other development. So I think it's largely in line with the public benefit provided by these parcels and maintaining that. And then we also have the obligation of the contract. My one potential thought is this has been, this was brought to this city staff in 2022. It took until now to bring it to council. We have until the end of the year. I understand there are other factors, but we could, I think, potentially consider the conservation easement part if we think there are substantive things that need to be addressed. I will say I think that it's a layer of additional protection is my understanding, and it's still not allowing things that aren't allowed by other codes. So it's sort of an additive layer of conservation protection. So that's my read of it, which doesn't seem like it needs to be additionally vetted. However, I'm also open to that particular point. Councilmember Hall, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think for the most part, I agree with everything that's been said when it comes to what we can and what we can't do and what we're kind of restricted to. I do think a lot of the concerns that we're hearing about are around the conservation easement plans and some concern around the potential flexibility and uncertainty there, whether or not it's reflective of everything over those properties. And so those are the kinds of questions that I potentially would see value in going to the environmental board and saying, is this a concern to you that we go into more depth on this to review? Because number one, to me, that seems like kind of the reason why we brought them, why we established the environmental board, and also they're always talking about wanting to really be helpful and contribute to these kinds of efforts. So I see potential value in taking that kind of policy question to them. Is this a concern to you? Do you see that there is kind of uncertainty and flexibility here, or to the points that you were making, Director Watling, or is it the opposite? And kind of having that kind of high-level conversation with them, and then seeing how in-depth they might want to go. It doesn't necessarily need to be as extensive, I think, as unless they want to, as was prescribed earlier. So those are kind of my initial thoughts. I don't see any harm with going board and commission level, especially if they want to be helpful in this process. Send it back to you, Chair Hunt.
Chair Hunt.
Yes.
You know, our suggestion is if there's additional scrutiny, that perhaps it happen here, because the time and energy it will take to bring 2 boards and commissions up to speed, to even get them to a point to be able to address the question you're asking, I think is going to be difficult. So perhaps what we could do is, if you'd like, we could come back with a presentation, talk about each property, put up side by side each of the existing constraints that are on the deeds that are on the funding agreements and this easement, to demonstrate how they all come together. Because otherwise we would have to, I think, start at the beginning with each of the boards and commissions, explain what this is, try to explain the levels, and because you're asking them then to evaluate, is this good enough? And we would have to have them get to the point of being able to understand what constitutes good enough, even in their own opinion, based on the information that we would share. And so my guess is that's 2 meetings of each of the groups that meet monthly. They're not going to meet in August. They already have full agendas. Poor Stacy's got another meeting tomorrow night, 3 nights in a row with the Environment Board. So that means we would then perhaps be back to you, if we did September, October, get the recommendations in October, comes back to you in November. It's at the full council at the end of November or 1st of December, which we're happy to do. But at the same time, does that warrant the issue before you versus the other matters that both the Environment Board and the Park?
Yeah, thank you. So the suggestion then is to bring this back to this committee before it goes to the full council, specifically focusing in on the conservation
If you
easement
feel that you're
language,
not satisfied
that,
with
yeah.
the multiple layers of protection that are currently there, then we will take your time to walk through each of the levels point by point.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think another option that we have exercised in the past is to bring that additional information back. I think it's pretty clear. It's like a matrix with the protection from Title 18, the protection from the other covenants, and then the protection that the conservation easement has on the different properties. And that could come back to council with the full packet. I mean, that is another option that we've sometimes done, just requesting specific information that is brought back to us if we don't think we need to, as a group, discuss that necessarily. And we can always pull it off of.
Well, we would leave it on regular agenda. So
we could discuss it in the regular agenda then.
We had planned to bring this back, I think, on July 22nd, the full council, if there was action this evening.
July or August, we have a few things to, on the documents, the transfer of development, the certificates have to be prepared, the legal description and everything, so.
So if we came back on August 5th, had this on regular business with that kind of walkthrough, the August 5th meeting, at least this morning wasn't very crowded, but, we could do that on August 5th and then have the full council have it in the packet and then work with the chair to decide how much detail you want to go into with the council presentation.
Okay, thank you. So those are the options, I think. And okay, so direction needed. We recommend. Okay, so we've answered the second part of this, I think, completely. It's really on the conservation easement part, which is the first part of direction needed. How do we feel about the options of getting or having more information on conservation easements brought to the full council versus another meeting of this committee versus to a board? Councilmember Hall.
That's a good point about kind of the effort and how long it would take to bring boards and commissions up to kind of the point, not even necessarily where we are, but beyond we are, to be able to make that kind of decision and make a recommendation to us before the end of the year. The same could be said for if we take it to full council with the rest of the council. That would be their first touch with it too. So I think I would prefer maybe a second touch with kind of the breakdown here at PDE. That would just be my thought.
Second touch here.
Second touch here at PDE, yeah. Curious what you two think.
I'm scrolling through the calendar trying to figure out which PDE meeting we would end up bringing it to.
You don't have anything scheduled in August.
Yeah.
So that means either you have a special meeting in August, then
Or
the
we're
council
looking at the
still wouldn't act
September
on it.
9th. So, yeah. I think I am leaning to, our colleagues on the full council can lean in or lean out as much as needed on a topic. And if we at least have the three of us that are engaging and another, I would feel comfortable bringing it to the full council and just being very clear with them. We're not debating TDRs. We're not debating whether or not this happens. We're just making sure that we're hitting a schedule and understanding what the requirements are there. So I think my preference would be to do full council on the 5th.
Okay, thank you. Additionally, we do have a meeting in between if we are at the August, the first meeting in August for the full council. We would have another regular council meeting between then and now where we can also, I as the chair can also recap this meeting. I think the full council is going to have to, or, the full council will have to approve this in any event. So it's really how clear do we want to be and have done our recommendation ahead of time on the specific item. So I think that I'm also okay with bringing it back to the full council. But yeah, how does that sound? Does that seem okay if we make the recommendation to or we can do a special meeting. I think those are the two scheduling options.
So what you're saying is we have another council meeting, so if we didn't make a decision at the next council meeting, it could.
Sorry, no, what I was saying was that at this next meeting, regular meeting, I can do my report out and let the council know that most of our discussion was on this particular item. When this particular item comes back, we are going to have additional information.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not actively opposed to it. I still think that there's probably value in talking about it amongst us three at another committee meeting or a special committee meeting or something like that. If you do think that we can accomplish and get to the same outcome with regular council.
I think we have a request in for additional information. I think we are aiming for the August 5th meeting. If that information can come out sooner, since it may be of interest to us and the full council, that would be great. Are we? Okay. All right. Do you have what you need from us on this item?
We do. Just to summarize, August 5th, full council, regular business agenda, and then in addition to what we've shared today, we're going to have a comparison for the two new park easements that we have for Corra and for Harvey Manning. The existing covenants and restrictions that are already on the property as part of grant obligations, the new proposed, the regulatory checks and balances that are in place. So lay that out, and then that's it, right? Okay.
Yeah, I think it would just be really helpful to hear, here are the concerns also, here are the concerns that we heard in committee, here's our kind of reaction to it, or here's why we think this is right or nuanced or wrong. It'd be really helpful to
Yeah, I think some of the public comments today were more about what does stormwater mean and things like that. So in the comparison that, in addition to that, we can try and explain what those things are meant in the easement, if that's of interest to council, or if there's any particular thing in the easement language that you'd like us to explain.
I think from our earlier comments, it's really about
The
things that are
between-
allowed that would be in some sort of conflict with conservation goals or,
Got it.
yeah, that's
Sounds good.
what we're wondering. Yeah, okay. All right, I think we are concluded with our first item. All right, we will move to our second item. Thank you all again on that one. Okay, the second item is COM 0061, annual amendments to Title 18 and Title 3. This is presented by Stephen Padua, Long Range Planning Manager. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Hunt. Just give me one moment to my presentation up. Okay. Good evening, committee members. Tonight I'm going to talk about the annual updates to our code, which for this year includes Title 18 as well as Title 3. The purpose of this is to review the proposed amendments that are focused on issues that were identified by staff through implementation of the code for the last year. I'm not going to read through each of these because I'm going to go through them in my presentation, but we have 7 policy questions for the committee tonight. A little background information on our annual updates. So last year, the city completed a multi-year project to overhaul our land use code. And as a result, we wanted to make sure that we had an annual review process so that we don't have to do that again. And we maintain our code and consider modern best practices and make sure it's up to the level of detail that we want it to be for achieving the city's vision for land use development. And so since June 2023, staff have been applying the code through various projects, through various questions from applicants and prospective applicants, and identifying issues where clarification is needed, as well as additional code language is needed, which is identified in the 7 policy questions for tonight. So we presented all the issues, the clarifying amendments, as well as the policy questions to the Planning Policy Commission on June 20th, and then held a Planning Policy Commission public hearing on June 27th. And then tonight we are presenting the resulting draft amendments we would like to vote for council's consideration. So these first 2 amendments are actually items that were proposed to be removed by Planning Policy Commission. So they are included in the committee's packet for tonight, but we just wanted to highlight the change from what was presented to Planning Policy. So this first item is related to the pre-application meeting requirement, and the proposal was to change the requirement for pre-application meetings to be required post-submittal and recommended as prior to application submittal. And the purpose of this change was actually to comply with provisions that were provided in State Bill 5290 that would allow exemptions from committing to refunds if for some reason for a particular application or project we aren't able to meet the review timelines for that project. And so the bill provides in the provision several options to comply with that exemption, and this option was one of those options that we were choosing to use to comply to be exempted for refunds. The Commission did not recommend moving this forward, so it is not included in the draft amendment. The second item that was removed from the draft amendment list.
Okay, sorry, you have many questions, actually.
Yes.
Council President Walsh.
Yeah, I watched the meeting. So can you explain a little bit more if these are removed, even though the administration says we need this in order to comply with State Bill 5290 and not pay or do potential refunds, you guys are no longer recommending we move that amendment forward?
What we're proposing is a recommendation that's consistent with the Planning Policy Commission's recommendation. So that is what's included in your packet tonight.
How do we then comply with State Bill 5290?
So this provision is actually an optional provision. It's not necessarily that we have to do this. We're choosing to do this in order to comply with the exemption that they're allowing us to have. So it's not necessarily, we can move forward without this. We would then be committing to having to refund if we don't commit or if we don't meet a development review timeline. And
Okay, well,
hand it over
I
to
think,
Director Dawes.
yes.
So, we're still waiting for guidance from Department of Commerce on how to implement 5290. It doesn't go into effect until January of 2025, these strict timelines. The state law had 8 things that we had to choose 3 out of 8 options. So that would, if we picked 3 that we could meet, then we are out of that refund provisions. So there's a lot happening at the state level. All the cities are struggling to kind of get that guidance and figure out what their options are. So in terms of timing at this point, that's the discussion Planning and Policy Commission had, and we had initially recommended this because we were in the middle of the housekeeping code changes, but that's a separate discussion, in terms of compliance with the State Bill 5290 that we're going to be tracking and keeping track of, and we'll bring forward the administration's recommendation on those in 3 out of 8 provisions at a future time. So this was removed from this housekeeping code amendment list, will be bundled with other process improvements and options related to State Bill 5290 as we get more guidance from Commerce.
That was my, is that okay? That was my question too. Yeah, and I thought even I heard the word defer this decision at the PPC hearing to wait for guidance. So would we have an opportunity to act on this
Yes.
in
so
this cycle just later once we hear from feedback, or is the idea that it would be
yes, as part
next
of
year?
implementation of 5290, if there are any code amendments needed, we'll bring those forward.
At that time, sometime between now and the next regular
As we
annual
get
updates.
more guidance,
Okay.
yes.
Right.
One more question on this one. The timelines being met, this has been a challenge in the past for the city?
It has, but we have streamlined a few things. So the code language was we cannot have this community meeting on any other day that the city has any other meeting. It can only be on Tuesday and Thursday. And with all these other restrictions, it took a longer time to kind of plan for that. But as part of our permit process improvements, we're looking at, getting it started early on. The other part, I think, was this has to happen before they even apply. So technically, it doesn't count towards your, the clock starts ticking when you are deemed an application is complete. So that's the guidance we're waiting for from Commerce. So if you can't count this as part of your completeness, and developers have told us that there's value. They want to hear early before they've invested too much time into designing. So that's why Planning and Policy Commission said, well, if the developers don't care, the community thinks there's value, why do we jump to the conclusion and make this change now? I think that was their rationale for removing it from this suite of changes that we bring.
Okay, thank you.
The next item on the list, it's related to tree removal tracking. And so proposed amendment included removing the requirement for community planning development to track tree removals for public projects. The justification for the proposed change was through implementation of the code, we found that Public Works and the Parks Department actually already track removal of tree projects with public projects. And so this change was actually to remove the redundancy. In discussion with the Planning Policy Commission, they were recommending removing this from the amendment list, primarily because they wanted to wait until the urban forestry plan was completed so that we have a better idea of how tree removals are being tracked and monitored throughout the city and how it meets the city's goals for tree canopy. And so it is not included in the committee's packet tonight for that reason. The next item on the list is related to technical document review. This is your first policy question that's listed in your packet. The proposed changes to actually add flexibility in the language related to the requirements for tech document review to allow applicants to complete specific technical documents rather than all together, which is what the current requirement is now. And so this would allow applicants to have a little more flexibility without the burden of completing all technical documents that are required to and make the decision on whether to pursue the project early on. The Planning Policy Commission recommended approval of these draft amendments as proposed. The next item is related to heat pumps and similar equipment installations. The proposed changes to allow heat pump installations within regulated setbacks, which currently code does not allow. The reason for this change is due to the growing demand as we're seeing with the impacts of climate change. We're seeing a lot hotter summers and a lot longer hotter summers. And so a lot of older buildings within the city weren't installed with any of these types of cooling equipments, which does not match or which has led to a growing demand. So we are proposing to allow heat pumps in regulated setbacks. In discussion with the Planning Policy Commission, they asked for 2 changes for the draft language. The first is to require that installations in the side setbacks be installed closer to the primary structure rather than to the property line. The other change was to require screening if the installation's in the frontage setback. So the question for the committee is, should the city allow heat pumps or similar equipment to be installed within regulated setbacks? And the Planning Policy Commission recommended the draft changes as proposed tonight.
Councilmember Hall.
I'm also happy we just as a committee want to go through it all and do questions. Is there value in just kind of stopping?
I think this is okay.
This is good. Okay, because I have a lot of kind of just clarifying questions in this one, and they had a great discussion at PPC around this. So the screening. My first question is around the screening. So I'm curious. So there is requirement for this screening. Is there value, or I guess maybe I should just ask it this way. What is the value of having this kind of blanket screening requirement from a city perspective as opposed to letting like the neighborhood make that decision for themselves, like the HOA decision? What do you think are the kind of trade-offs there?
The discussion with the Planning Policy Commission was more around aesthetics. With being installed in the front side of the buildings, they didn't want that to be more of an eyesore, that being an impact in any of the neighborhoods. Now, some of the neighborhood associations might already require some type of screening for these type of installations. You'd have to look at and whether or not any of them specifically already require that. But that was the discussion that we had with the Planning Policy Commission, which is why we added it to the draft amendment.
Okay, so there wasn't really any, I mean, I guess my question is really more as, do we see this as an opportunity, or do we see this as our role, or is this really an opportunity to take a step back? This can be kind of a more local decision on aesthetic with regard to screening. But I suppose also there's argument that the HOA hasn't done this. Maybe this is kind of the foundation for the city. Okay, well, anyways, I'll come back to that in comments. For the same provision, or for this revision, permanent amenity was changed to mechanical structure, something like that, to accommodate a couple commissioners who had concerns around, well, what could that lead to in the future? That's kind of unforeseen. Do you have any of the same concerns with the language as it is now, including like mechanical? I think it's mechanical equipment included but not limited to.
I think as the code is currently written, it's clearly defined on what permanent amenities is. But to the commissioner's point, it's not intuitive. If you just read the requirement on permanent amenities within the setbacks, you would have to go and find that definition. And that's what staff actually had to do. So to give commissioners credit of changing the language to mechanical equipment, it is a little more self-explanatory, intuitive in terms of like what exactly do we mean by allowing the installations in the required settings.
We feel more comfortable with that term.
Yeah, in doing additional research, we didn't find any conflicts with changing the language.
Okay, well, good. What about the word adjacent? I know there was some conversation around that too. Maybe that was fixed with the like as adjacent as operationally feasible part, but what's your thought about the word?
Some of the staff thinking around the installation of installing in the side setbacks directly adjacent as operational feasible was to allow flexibility in terms of installation, because most of when the installers put these mechanical equipments, they're wanting it directly adjacent to the building, but sometimes there's something in the way or the location of the piping needs to go somewhere different because of the location of the furnace or the hookups into the house. And so we didn't want to put too much restriction that actually increased the costs too much on the homeowners.
Monument signs. Well, I have a couple of questions on noise, but maybe it's not. The plan is to come back and have a broader conversation around noise,
Yeah.
right?
So because we had, for the noise ordinance particularly, we had to provide Department of Ecology a longer comment period. So that'll be something that'll be coming back later on to the committee.
Okay, well then I won't ask my question. Thanks. Those are my questions.
Okay, I have one quick question on this. What was the impetus for this change? Is it that there were complaints about them?
There were complaints that homeowners weren't being allowed to install them, particularly with townhome installations. They're very limited on where they can install it, and sometimes they don't have any area in the rear setbacks or limited yards where these installations can go, so they're limited. And with like zero lot line developments, there's no side setbacks, so they're only allowed to put it in the frontage. So this is really a combination of that growing need for these type of installations, particularly for properties that don't have a whole lot of room.
Okay, so the complaints were not, there were complaints that led to changes, but the complaints were not about the need for screening and the unsightly, that wasn't it.
One complaint about noise,
One
where
complaint
the
about
neighbor
noise.
who didn't have this was bothered by noise.
Okay. One complaint about noise, more complaints about issues with citing these that homeowners wanted to be able to put them in townhomes. They couldn't do it under current code. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
So the next proposed changes is related to the lighting code. The proposed changes to allow stadium lighting to exceed the minimum requirements with a lighting study. The purpose of this is to actually recognize limits within the market for lighting. What we found in our research is that the market doesn't actually produce stadium lighting that is within the limits of what we have established in the lighting code. And so this change is to recognize that. In discussion with the Planning Policy Commission, they asked for additional language that recognized that this lighting study should include mitigation strategies that comply with the Dark Sky Initiative. And so that language was added for this draft amendment. So the policy question is, should the city allow stadium lighting to exceed the minimum color rendering index with supporting lighting studies paired? And the Planning Policy Commission is recommending approval as drafted in your packet tonight. The next item is related to monument signs, and it's really more of a clarification of what is required for monument signs is what's being proposed. It is a policy change primarily because the language within the sign code isn't clear in what direction we're supposed to go with monument signs, which is why it's being posed as a policy question. The question being posed is, should the city change the requirements for monument signage on where prohibited and where current signs may be modified or removed. And the Planning Policy Commission didn't have any recommended changes, but they did have a recommendation for the administration to consider allowing monument signs for new developments, which is what's not currently allowed within the code.
Councilmember Hall.
So, thank you. So then, just for clarity, I think these conversations at the PPC level kind of got morphed in my head a little bit. So, just one on clarity that you're saying for when they're allowed and prohibited. Like previously, it was like said allowed somewhere, and then it said prohibited, and now it's making that clearer across the pages. I think I saw you were like scrolling in the hearing, and then the other conversation is just whether or not to allow them outright another time.
Yes,
that you guys are looking at.
Yeah, and so the ask from the commission is to, in future updates of the code, to consider adding this as a policy question of should we allow monument signs for new developments. They approved the draft language on clarifying for existing monument signs what exactly is required.
Is there a lot of demand for monument signs that I'm not aware of?
There is demand for the modification of a monument sign. So I think while we respect PPC asking us to look at future new monument signs, the main issue here is the existing.
Yeah, there was one community member who came to the Planning Policy Commission who requested, it's an existing building and he can't put up monument sign because they're not allowed. And he did ask the Planning Policy Commission to evaluate whether that should be allowed or not. And the reasoning for not allowing is because in Central Issaquah you have a build-to line standards, so that's sort of the reason. When you are going to have your building it to the street's edge, you're allowed a building wall mounted sign, but redevelopment happens over a long period of time. So some of these properties that are converting from residential to commercial zone have expressed in it, one person has expressed.
The next item is related to landmark signs, and the proposed update is to clarify for landmark designation requirements what exactly is required once a landmark sign designation is established. In discussion with the Planning Policy Commission, they asked that we include additional criteria as well as a process for making additional changes so that we are still establishing more flexibility with landmark signs, but at least establish, not making it so flexible that a property owner is able to do anything they want with the landmark signs. And so the question is, should the city simplify the requirements for how a landmark sign designation is maintained? And the Planning Policy Commission recommends approval as drafted in your packet. The next two items for code sections 3.71 and 3.72 weren't subject to the public hearing, so they weren't discussed at the June 27th meeting with Planning Policy Commission. But in discussion with them, they did not have any changes, recommended changes for what's being drafted for these code sections. The issue is with the traffic impact fees, we want to clarify with the change of use when the traffic impact fees are actually exempt. And for traffic impact fees and for park impact fees, they're not consistent with the language what's in the fire impact fee code language. And so the policy question for both is, should the city update the language for both traffic and park impact fees to clarify when a change of use is exempt from the impact fee? So the timeline for the code amendments is this will next tentatively go to council for review and action on July 22nd. And the administration recommends approval of all proposed amendments presented tonight. And for the presentation, I only went over the amendments that had a policy question, but we're happy to discuss any of the other clarifying amendments in your packet.
Okay, thank you. Council President Walsh.
I'm going to jump right over to those minor amendments. Just one question. It's 18.604.040.a, bike parking. That one changed from and to or. And if I'm reading that correctly, the first portion said 2 spots per building and 1 per whatever it was, square footage or whatever. Now it would read 2 spots or 1 per whatever portion. Could that mean that a building would only be required 1 bike parking spot?
That's correct. And then the reason for that, the clarification was because when we were looking at administering that code, there wasn't actually clear direction on which one we were actually supposed to be requiring, whether it's both together added up or choosing one. And the intention was to actually have one or the smallest amount or the maximum amount. And so that's why the change was made, change from and to or.
So you just said the intention was to choose the maximum amount?
As the starting point for what's being required. So it's if the...
So the only time somebody would go down to 1 is if they had a really small building or a really small number of whatever the units was.
Correct. We didn't want to require a portion of a parking space if it was a smaller unit.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like bike parking should always come in at least 2, but I'll not argue that one too much. Thank you for the clarification on that. I think that's my only question.
One additional question on the last, the exempt fire versus traffic issue. Why couldn't there be different exemptions, or why is standardizing those important? Seems possible that you could just have different exemptions intentionally.
It's possible, but it creates a little bit of confusion, which is what staff experienced when we were applying the code of when fire code is, or when it's, the fire impact fees are supposed to be applied with a change of use. And then we look at the traffic impact fees. We're having to now look at it a little bit different in terms of what gets applied, but the intention was that they get applied together, despite what the change of use was.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Hall.
I don't have any other questions about fees, but in the public hearing, there was a gentleman from Tallis who also had just talked about challenges with regard to like tree code and open space up in Tallis, and then also around landscaping and the lack of code around like irrigation standards and appropriate vegetation so it doesn't damage sidewalks and stuff like that. I know that's not relevant to this, but I'm just curious because I've had that conversation with them as well previously. Is that something we're thinking about or looking into for kind of a future update or just future consideration?
So as part of phase 2 is the tree code, conversation that we're going to have with the environmental board and others before it comes to you. So some of the tree stuff is going to get fixed in there. Some of the things with the landscaping were already fixed in Title 18, but these are things that were planted many years ago. So we do now require structural soil. We require minimum soil volumes and minimum widths to accommodate for sidewalks and trees in a healthy way, so you're avoiding the high edges over the long haul. The other stuff, I think, that was his request was bonding requirements. Then, so the implementation, that's not really, from a code perspective, but it's also what kind of documentation we're asking for the bonds and being very clear what can it be pulled for. So that we've already made some adjustments on the implementation side as it relates to bonding.
Any additional questions? All right, then we will go to public comments on this item. And I will first check in if there's any member of the public that would like to comment on this item. Not seeing anyone. And I will check in with City Clerk if there's any members of the public online that would like to comment on this item.
Chair Hunt, I see no virtual hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. And we will go into comments, and we have direction needed on all of these, so we can take them one at a time, or we can pull down ones that we want to talk about further. What is the council's preference there?
I'm pretty comfortable with doing them all at once.
Okay.
Per council.
Great.
I can start if you want.
Go ahead.
Yep. First of all, I'm just very pleased that we are doing this. Very, very pleased. And many of these were things that I was tracking as council president because I get the emails from the community. And so I wanted to make sure that things like the heat pumps and everything came through. So I am generally in agreement with this final version of the proposal. The only one that I will push back on a little bit is the pre-application meeting. I think I'm pretty comfortable with doing that. That being said, I do recognize the interest in reviewing all 8 of the options and choosing the ones that work. I thought it was a pretty compelling argument that if you have to do this pre-application, doesn't that feel like part of your application time clock? And I think given that developers and the community all find it very useful, I don't see that going away just because we say you don't have to do it pre-application, you have to do it post-application, and you can do it pre-application. So I thought that was a really smart choice from the administration. And so if it needs to be taken somewhere to consider all of it as a whole, I'm fine with that. But I do want to make sure that we get that done before January and that we recognize the risks of what the change for state bill is, and also our desire to streamline permitting and recognize that we don't have to be a barrier on as many things. So I would be interested in hear what other council members say.
Councilmember Hall? Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the level of depth you went in on all of this, and I'm glad staff have identified opportunities to come back and review for this. And then also, of course, the level of depth with Planning Policy Commission. I was very impressed, as I continue to be, and our newest member with Planning Policy Commission. I continue to be impressed with the level of detail that they go in. So for the most part, I'm happy with the direction that the administration is recommending, or that PPC and the administration are recommending for all these. I gotta say, I don't think the screening part is a priority, but if that's what PPC thinks is important to just maintain that aesthetic, to me, that seems like an opportunity for kind of locals to really decide what's necessary. But if they want to do that and the administration agrees, that's perfectly fine. And then I'm also fine with deferring that very first question around the pre-application or community meetings until we get that guidance later. My question for that would be, once we do get that guidance, does it go back to PPC or would it come to us? Or would it just go right to council?
Well, I think we've brought forward PPC's recommendation, so we won't go back to them for that. I think their recommendation is what is in front of you. If council chooses to go a different direction, then that can be handled now, or it could be handled with the phase 2 of housekeeping code amendments, which tentatively our schedule at this point is looking like after comprehensive plan is work, because that's a significant amount of work that's going to come in front of the boards and commissions, and we don't want to, pull them in multiple directions. So which is once in a 10-year kind of work that's going to happen, so their attention is going to be on comp plan. So we're thinking tentatively probably late 2024 or even first quarter of 2025 when it'll come back. We're welcome to take it back after the guidance and ask PPC again and bring forth their recommendation if you choose to.
Oh, I was just curious. I didn't necessarily have a thoughts on that, what you were. But okay, good to know.
Yeah, so we'll bring it with the tree code, things. There's also one item about art and creative art district. So there's some policy questions that we'll be asking PPC. So there are like 4 or 5 in that phase 2, right? Yeah.
I think the concern with the timing is it's hard to say when the guidance is going to come out from Commerce on this, or it's hard to say whether or not we could actually bring something prior to January. So that's part of the issue.
Thanks again.
Okay, so I think we have, so you have potential concern about the pre-application meeting one, or the flexibility there, and potentially going with requiring it pre-application.
PPC recommended to remove
flexibility.
that and the community meeting from this update. And what I am saying is, I think the argument for having that in is compelling. I think I would ask, the refund requires that we adopt 3 of the 8. So this is the only one that we're looking at here. Is that correct?
For a couple that we already do, like plan, you want to speak to it?
Yeah, so 2 of the provisions that's on the list that we already do. One is that we meet with developers to resolve issues as part of the development review process and schedule kind of separate meetings throughout our process. That's one thing that we already do. The other is that we have a budget for having a consultant on board as a supportive staff for development review when needed. That's also something that we already do. And so with those 2 and then this third one, that meets the 3 provisions for the exemption.
Okay, so I think my preference would be to move forward and have that included, because I think it's pretty important that we have that in place before January. I'm perfectly comfortable after that point to go back to PPC with a larger conversation about, which of these do we think is useful, if that conversation would make sense.
Okay, so you are advocating for the city maintaining current requirements. Is that correct?
I'm advocating for the city adding that amendment back in.
Okay.
Because when the city created this bucket of proposals, there were more than the 7, and PPC recommended removing that. I think it should be back in. I think there's too much risk. I think it's, yeah.
Okay, I think I tend to agree with that. I had the question about the timelines and meeting that, so I think having the exemption is beneficial. So I agree with that one. And then the one change that you are advocating for is around screening, potentially. Well, I think so too. So I don't think that, I think that we've heard from the community, my understanding is that we've heard we need to make it easier to install these. It's one of our things that we're able to facilitate for the community that helps us address our climate action goals. Buildings is one of our biggest sources of emissions. So this is also, it is a cost to folks that are choosing to install heat pumps. So adding an additional cost that's really aesthetic and requiring it from the state of the city, I don't think that that meets our community goals. So there are options, of course, for HOAs and other things to have additional requirements, but I don't see that as the role of the city. So I would be in support of not requiring those screenings as an additional cost for implementing a climate action that we're trying to incentivize for our community. So that's that one I agree with, and thank you for calling out that one. On the monuments, I just remember from previously serving on PPC that the arguments around having the monument signs for the central area where we want walkability, we want the buildings to be close to the street, so that improves the walkability versus buildings that are way set back. So I think that's a discussion that PBC can have again, but I do remember having that discussion previously, and so I think that can be another phase 2, which I believe is how it's slated for the new monuments. That's going to be in future conversations, right?
That's correct. Yeah, the plan was to potentially consider that policy question with next year's phase of code amendments.
Yeah, I think that's okay. I think I would be, if it were proposed to allow them in places where they aren't currently, I would probably not be for that at this point, having heard the arguments, for walkability around there. So I think I understand and I'm supportive of the other updates. I appreciate all the work that went into this with staff and PBC. So we have 2 changes then. Are you comfortable with the Council Member Walsh's?
I think so. Maybe
There's a lot of negatives in the like. There's an amendment removing an option. It's confusing to me as well. So
maybe I'm not following the risk that you were mentioning with not including it. So maybe if we do add it back as a committee and it comes before council, maybe there can just be a little bit about. It just seems like they had a good conversation about this and said we should defer it, and there was community concern.
So if the recommendation is to add that back into what we present to council for July 22nd, we can add additional information of what that risk is related to not being able to be exempt from refund. Is that what the committee is asking for?
So it's 80% of the fees would be collected and 20% would be returned back to the applicant. If we don't meet our timelines and we don't have 3 out of 8 picked. But the city can choose which 3 out of 8 are preferred.
Just say, I appreciated the presentation as it was made to PPC and the discussion there. And I hear what they're saying, this is something useful to the community. I think it's just important that we adhere to the portion of SB 5290 that reduces our need to give refunds if we go over by a day or 2. Our goal isn't to shoot the moon over that, but I think it's important from a taxpayer perspective that we don't go giving back money that we don't have to. And then I also think just the idea that we're not removing this or community meeting, we're just saying it's optional before you put in the application and it's required after, which really just shifts it a portion of time, which I think is completely reasonable. And having heard from developers that it's useful, I don't see, it can't be eliminated. It just shifts the timeline on that.
It's just at what level the community gets involved. So in the earlier version, if it's early, it's not fully baked. They haven't spent all that money and energy into designing the buildings and everything else, so they're more receptive to change, is sort of the other side of the conversation that was had, as opposed to bringing in an application that's fully baked. At that point, it's harder to make changes for the applicant.
Yes, and I completely understand that. I think if a developer wants to spend their money earlier on and then face the risk of community anger if they don't make a change, that's one thing. They can also make the decision to come in earlier, but that has some downsides for the community as well, because you might not see the full set of information and be able to react to it. So I think this provides the ability to have options, still have a requirement, and it protects the city from something that we would have to refund money.
Okay, maybe I am sold on this then. Let me ask a question though, because one of the concerns at PPC was if it's not required, some pre-application, some people are just going to be like, I don't need to do it then. Whoever sits right next to me. Yeah, are we still like very clear? Like, is there some clear communication avenue that like this is really in your best interest? And you should.
Yeah, we can put our handouts on that. I think the comment from the Planning Policy Commission member was we moved in the direction of providing clarity in the code, not this optional yes, no, and then, you know, if it's optional, most people will probably consider it no, you know, other than someone really finds value in it and they'll do it. So I think the comment from one of the commissioners, if I remember correctly, was more about being more clear. Is it required, yes or no? And you know, the optional was maybe is more ambiguous. I think that's what they were getting at.
Okay. Great. So we all agree with that one, and then you agree on the screening one?
Yeah, I think you guys made good arguments on that. I'm comfortable with removing the city's involvement in that.
Okay. The only other edit, and then do we have any additional recommendations? Otherwise, we are in agreement. Okay. Otherwise, we are in agreement with the staff recommendation on the other items.
Great, thank you. Just one clarifying question for this item going to council on July 22nd. Is it consent or regular business?
Feels consent-like to me, but is that staff's, okay. It can be on consent, thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you. Last item of business tonight is COM 0067, Housing and Parking Analysis Scope of Work, and this will also be presented by Stephen Padua.
Good evening again. So tonight I'm going to talk quickly about the scope of work that's being proposed for the housing and parking analysis projects. The discussion tonight is to hopefully get the committee's feedback on whether or not the proposed scope of work is consistent with what we've discussed in the past, and if the committee has any proposed changes. So it's a little background information. A lot of this work really originates from when the city developed the Central Issaquah plan back in 2013, when we established the vision for housing and the general environment for establishing a regional growth center in the city. And when we put in place the moratorium in 2016, we wanted to address several issues that were highlighted when development started to come into the city, and one being housing and the other being with parking. And that resulted in several changes to our parking regulations within the land use code. But it also resulted in the housing strategy work plan that was developed in 2017. And then through implementation of the housing strategy work plan, we got the Eco Northwest Diversity of Housing report last year, which came up with several recommendations on how to further look into getting to the city's vision for housing that was established from the Central Issaquah plan. And through the development of the Title 18 update project, we identified the parking regulations as being an additional item that we wanted to look into further to determine whether or not what we are requiring for parking actually matches our vision for development and growth for the city. And with additional new state legislation, that being House Bill 1110, that being the Middle Housing Bill, House Bill 1337 related to accessory dwelling units, and then the State Bill 6015, which limits what cities can require for parking structures, that is also furthering this need for what is being proposed for these two projects. So for the housing analysis project, we are proposing what was recommended from the diversity of housing report, that is to further look into the multifamily tax exemption and whether or not we want to establish a broader program for allowing or using this throughout Central Issaquah. The other recommendation was looking at our inclusionary zoning requirements and whether or not what we require now is actually meeting the vision for housing development and affordable housing in the city. The last piece is to look at our development bonus program, which has been underutilized since it was established back in 2015. For the parking analysis project, we wanted to include an economic analysis to look at the cost benefits of changing our parking regulations as it relates to housing development and the feasibility of housing to meet our goals. This also included evaluating our city-wide parking requirements, which is what was one of the things that was identified in the Title 18 update project on whether or not what we're requiring is actually helping us meet our goals for development, as well as the general environment for Central Issaquah as the broader community. And then with the State Bill 6015, we also need to take a look at what we are requiring for parking structures, as we're limited on actually what we require. And so potentially coming up with changes of what our regulations say around parking structures. So the timeline for these projects is to start soon, issue an RFP and hire a consultant to help us work through these two projects. The hope is to come up with initial recommendations early in 2015 and then have draft recommendations by mid to late 2025 and then have adopted regulations by the end of 2025. The administration recommends moving forward with the proposed scope as presented tonight. And that concludes my presentation for this item.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Councilmember Hall.
So for the parking analysis part of the project, or I guess they're separate project, but the first one was the economic analysis of modern parking practices. So I seem to recall, I had to go back to my notes for when we were like talking about the Title 18 whiteboard, the issues of parking and missing middle and just housing in general and Northwest report. But I remember asking if part of this process would be like evaluating what are those like really progressive kind of parking policies. I feel like on like urbanist Twitter and Instagram, I always see like this new city ended all parking requirements. Like, are those going to be the kinds of things that we do a kind of economic analysis for? Like, is that feasible? Would that produce the kind of outcomes that we would see in a city?
Yes, that's the intention. The idea is to look at all the modern best practices within our region and how cities are looking at it and what the costs are with changing those regulations to match what other cities are doing. But also look at the other strategies other cities are doing, whether it's parking minimums or maximums in consideration or changing those type of regulations, be consistent.
So you'd said in the region, are we kind of narrowing our focus to similar cities within the region, or are we looking?
The intent was to look at similar cities in the region, but we can look broader, just so we could see what are the impacts. We were trying to stick to cities that were similar in size to the city of Issaquah, similar-ish, but also look at cities with similar governmental structures, and so that we can consider organizationally how are we going to be able to manage this. And so that's why we also want to look at cities of similar size.
And then to clarify, okay. And to clarify, not a public commenter, but the MFT program is just for Central Issaquah, right? That was the original intent when we were talking, not including any of the area in Issaquah.
Correct. What we discussed previously with City Council and the committee was primarily just focusing the MFT for Central Issaquah.
Will we be able to learn anything from the MFTE pilot program that we've put in place by the time? Probably not.
Only if someone is we have discussions with a potential applicant about the program, yes, but we won't be able to, there won't have been not enough time to actually go through the motions of applying the program by that point.
Council President Walsh.
Thank you. I notice ADUs are mentioned in here, but really just in the portion that was talking about parking regulations. If I'm thinking back to what some of the areas were that we wanted to do for future updates was to try to encourage ADUs, and parking is only one portion of that. There's also permitting fees, there's lot line requirements, can we have a pre-approved plan like Redmond or Kirkland does? Are we considering any of those things?
Yes, but in a separate project looking at middle housing and ADUs. We have grant funds actually funding a project that we've already started looking at the regulations from House Bill 1110 and 1337. So that's why only the parking regulations related to the parking analysis was mentioned for these particular projects. That project will be coordinated with these two efforts so that we're looking at the feasibility of the overall development and how we're meeting our housing goals.
Okay, yeah, because it's hard to evaluate, is this doing everything that we want it to do if there's also, so I think it would be useful to better understand what's being considered elsewhere in addition to this. And then the other question, I appreciate the Title 18 future update list being added back onto the website. So there are 35 items on that list. Not all of them obviously relate to housing and parking, and so wouldn't necessarily be applicable to this, but how are we planning to address the rest of these? Is there a timeline for those? Is there anything in the housing and parking area that won't be covered by this?
For housing and parking in particular, I think the projects that we've started and are about to start will be covering what was called out for the Title 18 future updates list. Beyond that, for the rest of the list, I defer to Director Dhaliwal on how we want to prioritize or at least continue to have conversations about how we want to address that list.
Yeah, I mean, out of the 35, I think the council prioritized 3, the housing, parking, and stream buffer studies. So we've been focused on that, given with all the workload with comprehensive plan, and the capacity of staff and boards and council to get to mid-year discussions. We haven't really focused on anything beyond that. But we can look at, once we finish this work, what next can we handle at that point. So I think our focus at this point has been on comprehensive planning and these 3 mid-year discussions. So we don't have a timeline on the others.
Just to clarify, I completely agree with that. You guys obviously heard us on these are the priority areas. I just want to make sure we don't lose those. And so by bringing it up when we're talking about this, it continues to have it in the conversation and recognizing that it's still a list that we have to address. Thank you.
So when we were looking at Title 18, it seemed to me like there were also potential, we want to have different kinds of housing, and we know that the community needs different kinds of housing, and but there's also some interrelationship between things that we do on the housing code side and on the parking side. So there could be some joint recommendations, like a recommendation to do this housing policy with this parking policy. So if there's separate studies, how does that kind of joint recommendation, how would a joint recommendation come about?
The idea, or at least the approach that staff is taking with the 2 projects is actually requiring that the consultants actually coordinate with each other as we're doing the analysis and with the timing of different deliverables, particularly with like the economic analysis on best practice for parking, feeding into the conversations on housing, and then kind of them working with each other on tweaking what those requirements might look like, that work on the feasibility of housing as well as meeting what we're trying to intend with parking regulations in accordance to our discussions of the economic analysis.
Okay, great. And then also I've been participating in the discussions around the update of the strategic plan. One thing that came out of those is over the last 5 years, a lot more discussion around preparing for more electric vehicles and EV charging. Can that also be considered as part of this best practices and parking discussion?
we'll have to take a look at that in terms of the budget and the scope that we have for the project.
Okay.
And then we can discuss with the sustainability group in terms of like how best to approach, because we just had the discussions back in 2021 on EV regulations and that exceeding what the state requires, but we also want to make sure that we're keeping up with that and staying a leader with a lot of those regulations. So if we're in agreement with sustainability that we should include it or take a look at that, then that's something that we can include as part of the project.
Are we on questions or feedback?
I think we're still on questions. Do you have any additional questions?
Nope.
Okay. Any additional questions?
No.
All right. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on this item? Okay. Anne? Welcome.
Hi, I'm Ann Fletcher, 255 Southeast Andrews Street. I just want to make one point, and it fits in with just what you were saying. I'm just starting to research a little bit back on that 2021 EV infrastructure charging and understand it. And People for Climate Action is also working on that in all the cities. Partly because the state has a requirement of, I believe, 45% of the parking spaces need to be, I think, at least EV capable. So in looking at our 2021 ordinance, which I thought was ahead of the times, it's actually looking like it might be behind the times now. Because if you add up the 10% EV actual charging and the 30% of EV ready, there's nothing on our chart about EV capable. That means only 40% of the parking spaces would need to have something done with them, and 60% would have nothing. So I do believe that your question from our perspective is that really needs to be looked at as part of one of your studies. I don't know which one, but to further look at that. As I said, I just really started looking at that today. So I do believe that we need to incorporate that into what we're doing in these updates. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. All right. Anybody else in the audience that would like to make a comment? Not seeing anyone. Are there any members of the public online?
Yes, Chair Hunt. Nicole DeLeon would like to address the committee. Nicole, I have made you a panelist. You can unmute your microphone and turn on your camera.
Thank you.
Good evening, I think. Yes, I'm just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, thank you. Again, for the record, my name is Nicole De Leon, and my address is actually 524 2nd Avenue in Seattle. I am a land use attorney with the law firm Karen Cross and Hempelman, but I am here before you in my capacity as a member and representative of NAIOP Washington. NAIOP Washington is our state's commercial real estate association. It includes over 1,000 members, several of which are builders in Issaquah. We are very supportive of the committee's work and want to again thank you all for endeavoring on this very important research and analysis, particularly with respect to advancing the MFTE program. As I think you all know, it's an essential tool in the state that incentivizes creation of new middle income housing specifically. In other King County cities, MFTE has successfully created thousands of below market apartment homes. As our region's housing and affordability crisis deepens, we need access to every single tool possible to spur more housing production, including below market units. For this reason, we strongly encourage the city to expand the application of the MFTE program to citywide as opposed to just focusing on central Issaquah. And particularly in the Highlands alone, there are hundreds of potential affordable housing units that could be foregone if MFTE is not applied more broadly. We also request the study evaluate the benefits of voluntary incentive-based inclusionary zoning and bonus programs. Mandatory mechanisms tend to disincentivize development in the city, whereas voluntary incentive-based programs are needed to ensure that the city can accommodate, the significant velocity of growth that's anticipated in the city of Issaquah. Lastly, again, just really want to thank the city, the staff for undertaking this important work, and we truly look forward to continuing to work with the city as this all progresses. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. City Clerk, are there any other members of the public on the call?
No, there are not.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes our last public comment period of the evening. I will start off with comments if that's cool. All right. So I think this continues our exploration of the recommendations, but we're in the Eco Northwest report, which I think we should absolutely do, and which continues the work that we've been doing on Title 18 as well. Make sure that we're getting the kinds of housing that our community needs. I do recall that when we adopted the EV parking requirements, there was a discussion about that additional cost of having EV capable spots, and discussion around how to make sure that, especially for affordable units, that they weren't adding an additional cost. And so how could there be a trade-off with other requirements on those properties? And so I think in the spirit of that, and with knowing that there are more EVs coming due to other laws, and due to the fact that from our community surveys, we know majority of our residents are either interested in or have an electric vehicle. I think that would be an important change that I would like to see considered in the scope of work. I liked to hear that the housing and the parking teams are going to work together, because I think those joint recommendations are going to be really important. And in that same spirit, I think that the EV part of the parking could also be considered in a trade-off. Other than that, I am supportive, and I didn't identify any other recommended scope changes. Council President Walsh.
Thank you. A question: when you're talking about the economic analysis of parking and parking changes, is it looking at our code and proposed changes to our code? How do we factor in things like state law that are going to require changes that would increase the cost of development? Because it sounds like that's what this, some of the EV code, or there's another idea of evaluating and trade-offs.
I think the intent of the economic analysis was primarily to look at costs and benefit, or costs and benefits associated with exceeding what maybe is required from the state, rather than seeing what the benefits or costs is for complying with what the state regulations are, just because we're going to have to make the change anyway. But we can definitely take a look at what the difference is and once we make that change, to help communicate where we stand with the regulations and the economic impacts with making those changes overall. Is that what the...
Let me clarify a little bit, because I was on PPC when we were talking about the structured parking, and one of the things there is understanding what the cost of putting in a parking space is for a developer, and thus for the person who resides there or uses that space. If there are increased costs from a state level to putting in a parking space, whether that's a regular lot space or a structured parking, that's going to increase the cost of development. And so one of the factors that I'm going to need to consider when we get this information is it really worth it to me to have 5 spaces required for X number of square feet if that increases the cost by Y amount? So that's really what I'm asking. and understanding that any state changes are going to have an impact on what the cost is for that particular parking space.
Yeah, I would say the intention is to look at all those required changes and factor that into kind of that economic analysis as we're proposing something different.
Okay, and then my feedback is really just, I want to go bold, I want to go big. You know that from me. I'm going to put it out there. I agree. There's some really great things happening nationally, and so I would be really frustrated if after waiting this long to tackle this area that we only look at regional cities who may not have had the chance to do the work here already. I don't want to be limited by that. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that there is a big need here. And I don't want to be limited in those areas. So as long as I communicate that clearly and openly to whoever's doing this, really excited to see this happening. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Councilmember Hall.
Very much, especially on that last part, which is why I'm hesitant to include stuff about EV in this, because I could see how even just that could be a lot of capacity and a lot of work. And with the EV part, as you brought up, it's like it's very cost prohibitive for developers, depending on ask. For EV spots or EV capable spots for that infrastructure as well. And I think we had talked about how much it innovates all the time too, so we don't necessarily know where it's going to go. I'm not sure about that, although I guess I don't feel super strongly one way or the other. So if there is support of including that kind of in the parking analysis, and we feel that from a staff capacity perspective between now and Q1, Q2, 2025, we can include that, then great. But again, ditto to what the council president said. And yes, I agree with the proposed scope of work and very excited. This is what excites me the most, is what this project has slowly been creeping forward and over. So I can't wait for next.
Great. Yes, I agree with the go big and bold, and let's get some big recommendations out of this. We have been, this has been a long time coming, so it would be great to get some bold recommendations for us to consider. All right, so I think we all are on the same page, generally support. Do we want, maybe we could get additional information on what it could look like to include EV charging? Got some interest, and I don't know where you are on this.
Yeah, I think I would side more on the side of caution of including it, given that there's it was either 200,000 or 130,000 for this. I want a lot out of this. And so, yes, if there's a sense of understanding how much of, whether we can include that with the budget, I think that's fine. But I'm also willing to, I don't know, I was going to say, put that onto a sustainability action list. So yeah, I'm fine to get an estimate, but I don't want it to limit all of the other things that we've already had established on our future updates list.
Okay, so maybe when this comes back, if you can provide a estimate or a information on if this is feasible within the budget, or if this would be an additional budget item.
Yes, we can follow up. We'll consult with the sustainability group in terms of figuring out the discrepancy with the state requirements and try to factor that into how we're looking at the regulation changes.
Okay. All right. So I think our other advice is just go big and bold. Yeah. Anything else you need from us on this item?
That's everything I need. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Do we have any announcements? Okay. There being no further business and there being no announcements, we are adjourned at 9:42 p.m.